Good evening, fellow Toastmasters and guests. Today, I want to share a story about someone else. My last few speeches, I mostly talked about myself, but today, I'd like to talk about someone special. A long time ago, there was a boy named George. And George was a sweet kid, but he had a very difficult life. George was born in 1822. And George's mother was a Native American person. And for those of you who are Americans, you know that during that time, America had its westward expansionist policy of manifest destiny, where America was aggressively expanding westward, and they kind of had to push the Native Americans out of the way. So being a Native American in America was very difficult, and that was part of the suffering that poor George's mom went through. George's father was an African American. It's not exactly clear if he was a freed slave, but he was a freed black man. Luckily, George's father was not living in the deep south or in the southern states where slavery was widespread. He was living in upstate New York, where nevertheless, even though slavery did not exist in this particular region of America at the time, he was still not treated very well. And it was a really, really hard life in the early 1800s to be black. It was a really, really difficult time in the early 1800s to be a Native American. Poor little George was both. He, on top of it all, not only did he not get the acceptance of the majority ruling white people in America, but he was also not fully accepted by black people because he was not 100% black. He was not fully accepted by the people of his Native American mother's race because he was not 100% Native American. Poor George had a rough, rough life. Eventually, he ended up doing all kinds of odd jobs, growing up, a very tough life. And he later became a trapper. A trapper is a person who traps animals, guts them, kills them, sells the fur, and sometimes even sells the meat. Well, George did what he could to survive. And he eventually ended up making money from cooking the meat. And so he found a new passion: cooking. In the early 1850s, George, already being a grown man, ended up landing a job at a special, at the time considered a 5-star restaurant called the Moon's Lake Lodge up in Saratoga Springs, New York. His full name was George Speck. And at this restaurant, some of the most famous, richest names would come and eat there, including Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad millionaire, as well as many other high-demanding, wealthy customers would come to eat at this restaurant in upstate New York. Because George had a very tough life, he had this pent-up passive aggressiveness in him. And he was not a very kind person, and he didn't take very kindly to any insults towards his craft. Don't get me wrong. He was actually a very good cook. That's why he was working at this 5-star restaurant. Most of the time he got compliments on his cooking. But be very careful if you ever tell him that, if you would have told him that his food was no good. He would have made it so badly the second time if you sent him back into the kitchen, to the point where you couldn't eat your food anymore. That was him. To boost himself a little more, he also changed his name from George Speck to George Crumb. His philosophy is, the crumb is greater than the speck. So he was George Crumb. One day, a hot, blistery summer day, August 24th, 1853, this high, rootin' tootin', very stuck-up, affluent guy came in and ordered the specialty of Moon's Lake Lodge restaurant. It was called French fries. Wait a minute, before you think what's so special about French fries. In the 1850s, French fries was actually a luxury food. There were no vegetable oils to deep fry your French fries at that time. Vegetable oil was not commercially available until the early 20th century. There was no special potatoes mass-produced for this purpose. So at the time, French fries were actually served in boiled in animal fat, hand-carved painstakingly, and it was eaten with a fork. In the early 1800s, in the mid-1800s, French fries were actually thicker, softer, squishier, greasier, less salty, and kind of yucky. But you know what? It was luxury food. You ate it with a fork and spoon. One day a customer came in and said, "These French fries are too soft. I want you to make them harder." George got really angry and went back into the kitchen, made them better, and then he gave them back to the customer. "No, this is not going to do. These French fries, not only are they still too soft, they need more salt, and they are too thick. Please make them better." So what did George do? He went right back into the kitchen, deep fat fried them until they were absolutely crisp, where there was no way that a fork can pierce those French fries, cut them razor thin, and salted the tar out of them, and then brought them out to the customer. "Here you are, sir." The customer took one taste of these over-fried, over-cut French fries, and he said, "Marvelous." Absolutely marvelous. This friend later brought in all of his friends, and he demanded that he make these French fries the exact same way. So George eventually made the restaurant very popular, and he was able to gain so much money that he opened up his own restaurant, thus giving birth to the potato chip. Thanks to George Crumb, he died in 1914, retired a very wealthy man, and the French fry is now a $6 billion a year industry with 65,000 workers. So the next time you take a bite into a potato chip, thank good old George Crumb. Thank you, everybody.